coming all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, in the JSAC STEM Research Center. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the JSAC STEMcast. For those of you who are relatively new, the goal of this podcast is to get people interested in STEM and show that science, technology, engineering, and math are all around us, and the possibilities in a STEM career are endless and increasing every day. If you're asking yourself, what does JSAC stand for? Don't worry. JSAC stands for the Johnson STEM Activity Center. Our mission is to empower students from diverse and underserved communities through exposure to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and teach them the leadership skills to change the future. Hello, everyone. My name is Sophia Huynh, and I will be today's guest host. I'm a rising freshman from Columbia University this fall, and when I talk about topics that I am passionate about, I tend to ramble. In doing so, I believe this podcast kind of is the perfect outlet for me. So, to get started, let's go. Maya Angelou, Robert Frost, Langston Hughes, Edgar Allan Poe, and Emily Dickinson. What do you think all of these people have in common? If you guessed that all of those listed were famous poets, pat yourself on the back. Today, with my lovely guest, we will be exploring language itself, poetry, and the process of writing your own poems. How does poetry affect the brain? How does changing one word potentially give a poem a completely different meaning? These questions and more are what I will be discussing with my amazing guest today. Today's guest is a rising junior at the Paideia School, where she co-leads a creative writing club for student writers. Even though she's always reading new novels and experimenting with literature, she still feels like there's still a lot she doesn't know. In her spare time, she loves to read and write poetry, and today she's here to talk about how science and psychology behind the poems we read and write today. Everyone, Megan Walter. Hi, Megan. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. So, to start off, how did you first get introduced to poetry in the first place?
That's a good question. I've always been someone who's always reading. When I was little, it was picture books and then chapter books. I've always had a book in my hand, and I guess eventually I started wondering, can I write my own stuff? And that's how it started.
Oh, yes. How would you say poetry impacts your life?
I guess poetry is kind of like therapy for me. It's always been sort of a rock, when I have good things in my life, I can celebrate it with poetry. And then when I have harder things, I can also work through those with poetry.
Yeah, so do you have any favorite poets?
I do. Thank you for asking. Probably my two favorite poets are Mary Oliver and Amanda Gorman. Amanda Gorman is an activist, and she uses activism in her poetry, and I think that's something that I aspire to do too. And Mary Oliver is a really big nature poet, and I like to explore the natural world on paper as well. So yeah, she's a role model for me.
Yeah, so even through poetry, you can create change and societal change even.
Yes.
Yeah, so do you tend to write your own poetry as well?
I do a little bit.
Yeah?
A lot of it is stuff that I don't really show anybody, or it's seeds of a poem that haven't really grown up yet. And a lot of it is stuff that I revisit, and I'm like, you know what? Let's throw this away. But yeah, I like to write a lot.
Yeah, so during your writing process, there's a lot of different steps for your finished process, I guess, what you're telling me. I guess just take us through that process.
So it involves a lot of revision. Usually starts with an idea or half an idea sometimes. And I usually sit down in one sitting and write it all down. And then I'll come back to it in a couple weeks or days, or if I remember it, a year. And I'll kind of, rethink it and revise it and fine tune it until I think it's something good.
Yeah. So what are some of the things to keep in mind when you're writing your own poems?
I would say think about what message you want your readers to get from your poem, and then think about kind of the path that you can lead your reader down to get to that message.
So obviously writing is really important, but I think another thing that's really important is reading poetry. So what do you think is one of the most important things when you're reading your own poetry?
I would say one of the most important things when I'm reading poetry is, or even my own poetry, is have I conveyed the message that I want to convey, and is it something that's, clear to the reader? So if you have, if your poem is a window to your message, right, is it dirty? Can people actually see through? Or do you need to clean it up a little bit more through punctuation or word changes?
Definitely. So what are some of the problems that might occur for you when you're writing your own poetry?
I would say, like a lot of people, I have writer's block. It's basically like this wall and you can't really get past it and your ideas can't get past it. That's something that, I've had to work through.
Yeah, I can relate a lot. So
Yeah.
when I'm writing my own stuff, I have writer's block a lot. And then I think about it for maybe this topic for a week on end, and then I just can't seem to get over it. And then all of a sudden, a month later, just like, oh, I remember now. Yeah. So that's a bit difficult. But so for people who are not only interested in poetry, but also in STEM, how might poetry connect with STEM? Are there any certain aspects that can be tied directly to STEM?
Yeah, so a lot of poetry is psychology and learning how to manipulate. That's not a really nice word. Learning how to guide your readers to kind of the point that you're trying to get through, familiarity or associations or word choice or other things that we'll cover later.
Yeah, definitely. So you're talking a little bit on the psychology. What I find language itself to be really fascinating is the scientific aspect, more specifically the neuroscience behind it. So I took one neuroscience class. We'll just go over that. I think in our previous podcast, I talked a little bit about that as well. But I think language is such a big part of human evolution. And it's really one of the main factors that kind of differentiates us from all of these other species of animals, right? So we're kind of the only species that has complex language. And I'll go over what I'm referring to. So what I mean by complex language in neuropsychology, there's a few requirements, but I'm just going to go over some of the basic ones. So one, you can come up and formulate your own ideas and then be able to communicate with them. So if we're looking at a parrot, right, they can speak the human language, but they're not coming up with their own ideas and then formulating them, right? They take what we've come up with and they repeat and kind of mimic what we say. So that doesn't really categorize them in that, I guess, requirement. Number two, complex grammar, right? So even though English sometimes does not make any sense at all.
Yeah, a lot of times.
Yeah, a lot of times, definitely. It still has complex grammar where they have different syntax, punctuation, capitalization, all of that jazz. And then number three, the ability to read and write, and then also understand what you are saying or what you're writing or reading, right? So those are kind of the main three. So when you look at the brain itself, it's really interesting, especially with language as well. So a huge portion of the brain is actually dedicated for language. So when we look at neuroscience, usually language is categorized with the left hemisphere of the brain. But even that, so the right hemisphere is more known for visual aspects and your motor skills. But when we're, in terms of poetry, when we're reading and writing, you use your whole brain, right? So not only are you using your right hemisphere for the visual, so you're reading all the words, you're writing down all the things, you're using your left hemisphere in order to comprehend that language. So whatever you're writing, you need to comprehend, you need to understand the words. So you use the left hemisphere. And then there's a specific part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is usually associated for memory as well. So you need to memorize or remember all of those words that you're going to use. So all of these different parts of the brain are being used in something that we use every day to communicate, which I think is really fascinating. And so we're talking about poetry. You're using these languages, any type of language. Yeah. So I guess what are your opinions on that? I went on a really long ramble, but yeah.
I liked your ramble. I agree with you. I think that it's really cool how like all the different parts of the brain have to collaborate in like this one writing process. And it also, it translates into the reading process where, you read things, you remember your own experiences, and you relate to them to what you're reading.
Yeah. So a lot of times poetry is described as being very conceptual. So many poems often just get clumped together, but there's actually so many different types of poetry itself, right? So what would you say are some of these different forms or types of poetry?
So in general, I would say there's two genres of poetry. There's free form, which doesn't have any prescribed structure or pattern or rhyme scheme. And then there's also structural or formal poetry, which is like sonnets, and that has kind of like a recognized rhyme scheme or pattern that people have to follow.
In your opinion, is it true that everything in a poem matters? I mean, sometimes teachers ram in the fact that, for example, the poet didn't have to use the word the in the poem, right? But still chose to. I mean, what if the poet just used it because it's more convenient or familiar with them? I guess, does it depend on the situation? What's your take on that?
This is kind of a controversial topic, but I have a very strong opinion on that. When I'm reading, I like to dissect every single, punctuation point, every single word, sometimes the letters within words. So, I think that everything matters in a poem. I think it always does.
Mm-hmm. So everybody's listening. We all know she's that kind of person.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
Exactly.
Own it.
Yep. Are there any techniques people use when writing poetry, and what might some of those be?
Yeah, so definitely relating back to psychology, there's a lot of, familiarity techniques that we can touch on later. Associations, when you read something, does it make you think of something else? And general kind of word choice and diction.
So if you're reading a poem, what's the first thing that comes to mind? What do you usually look for first?
So the first thing, obviously, before you've even, read anything on the page is what does it look like, right? And this relates back to the right hemisphere, like visually, what do you see on the page? And I think that's like the form of it, right? It can either be free form or formal. It all depends on like, the poet and what they want to convey.
Yeah. So are there any limitations to this form?
I don't think there are. I think a lot of times people can have like, misconceptions about, the poem has to look like this. It has to have this type of rhyme scheme. But in my opinion, it can look like anything, and it's just up to you.
Yeah. So do you have any favorite poets who like to manipulate the form in their poems? If so, do you have like any examples?
Yeah. So I guess one poet that I really admire is Langston Hughes, and his poem Harlem, kind of likes to, put certain things by itself or in blank space, which adds drama. The last line is actually italicized, which is really cool. If you don't know it, you should check it out. It's a pretty great poem. And I admire the form in that poem.
Definitely. So we talked about form. Is there anything else that you look for in a poem as well?
Yeah, so I usually look for literal language and diction. So, literally like what can, through the five senses, what can you kind of sense or relate to in the poem?
Yeah, so you mentioned literal language and diction. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so basically it's like any type of imagery that you can, feel or smell or touch. So there's olfactory, you can smell it, auditory, hear it, visual, you can see it, gustatory, you can taste it. There's also one kinesthetic, which is like muscular movement, I think, which is pretty cool. So, and like organic imagery. So basically anything that with your five senses, that's literal.
So we talked about literal language. Does that have an opposite, and what would that be?
Yeah, so I would say that the opposite of literal language would be figurative language. So, anything, not like the five senses, anything you have to relate to, like comparisons, metaphors, similes, anything that's not, relating to the five senses would be figurative.
A lot of times in poetry, poets play with how words sound when we read poems. What would that be called?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to sound devices. So that would be like alliteration, consonants, assonance. how like different, you know, the beginnings of words or the middle of words. So alliteration refers to the repetition of the beginning sounds of words. So, for example, I hope you like my examples.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah, Alice ate alligator, right? So that's the repetition of the beginning A sound. In consonants, it's the repetition of non-vowel sounds that are not in the beginning of words. So, for example, in the poem Ozymandias, you should check it out, it has the line that says, of the colossal wreck, right? So it has the K repeating sound, but it's not at the beginning. And then third, assonance, which is the repetition of vowel sounds in words. So that would be like, Heather liked the weather. Yeah.
Yes, of course, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty good examples.
Thank you. So, a lot of times we do tongue twisters, right? So, Peter picked a peck of pickled peppers.
Yes.
Or
yeah.
Betty bought a batch of better butter to make a bitter butter better. But it soon became bitter. So Betty bought a batch of better butter to make the bitter butter better. You know,
I appreciate that.
Yeah, me showing off my skills.
Yes.
I can do it faster, but, you know, in order to comprehend on this podcast, we must do it slower. So for all of those tongue twisters, would that fall under a sound device? And if so, which one would it be?
Yeah, so I definitely think that your first example, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers.
Yeah.
Can't even say it. That would be alliteration. So with the P repeating sound. And then Betty bought a batch of butter. I don't even know what it is. But yeah, that would be also alliteration with the repetition of B. Yeah.
Are there any other, I guess, tongue twisters that might not be alliteration, that might be a different sound device?
You know, I don't know any off the top of my head, but if you had an extended version of Heather liked the weather, you know,
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that would work.
Yeah, we can make our own poems starting with Heather liked the weather, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're going to tie more sound devices, right? So you talked about the 5 senses. One of those is the auditory, right? So how does sound devices impact our psychology when we're reading poetry?
Yeah, so I kind of like to think that the sound devices have this kind of background poem going on as we're reading the poem. So back to the poem Ozymandias. If you haven't read it, you should really check it out.
Thanks for the plug, yeah.
Yeah. Basically, it's about the statue that crumbles, right? And as the statue is literally crumbling in the poem, the consonants is actually crumbling as well. So it goes from colossal wreck to bare and boundless, maybe, to sand stretch far away. So it's kind of like you can actually hear the consonants crumbling, and it kind of creates like a, you know, side poem, I guess.
Yeah, so it has that auditory effect.
Yeah.
So neuropsychology, again, when we're looking at it, it's manipulating our auditory senses, right? And how we hear it, and then how our brain receives that information, and then how we understand. So again, the left hemisphere of the brain. You know, just me connecting everything together.
Lots of psychology.
Oh, yes. So after sound devices, what else would you look for in a poem?
After sound devices, I usually look for, I would say, like, figurative language. Yeah, you know, like metaphors, similes, any type of comparisons. Yeah. What do you usually look for next?
What do I usually look for? That's a really good question. I'll be honest. I don't really read a lot of poetry. I tend to write my own, but reading's not really my thing, you know. But I really like using metaphors. I think metaphors are a really great way. I think they're a lot more bolder for some reason than similes, you know. If you're using words like and as, I don't know, in my opinion, they're not weak-willed, but metaphors are bolder. It's just a statement, you know. It is a boulder.
I see. I think you should start reading more poetry. In my opinion.
No, definitely after this podcast, I will be reading a lot more poetry.
Definitely.
You know, definitely going to be reading Ozymandias.
Oh, yeah. Gotta check that out.
Oh, yes, definitely.
And then after metaphors, I probably look for associations. Mm-hmm. So basically, like, you know, what in this poem makes me think of something else? Like, does the writer want me to do that? Is it something that comes from my personal experiences? And there's 2 types of associations: denotations, which are positive, and connotations, or cons, which are negative. It really impacts your reader by kind of evoking, you know, negative feelings or positive feelings.
Yeah, so what might be some of those examples of a denotation or a connotation?
Yeah, so I think a classic denotation would be, like if you write about something sweet and sugary, most people will think of good feelings or associate that with good experiences. Whereas, like if you write about something cold and barren or wintry, you might associate that with more negative feelings.
Yeah, so would you say some of these associations are formed by society or by individuals or somewhere in between,
Yeah, I think that delves into the science of, associations, public psychology versus, your private psychology. I think it's both. I think there's a lot of socially imposed biases, such as like darkness being equated with negativity when that's, more socially constructed and not necessarily rational. And there's also personal ones that, like, based on your own experiences, you associate certain things with negativity or positivity.
Do you have any favorite associations for you that kind of impacts you when you read poetry, maybe?
That's a good question. I would say that if I read anything about chocolate, I get really happy because I really love chocolate. So, anything, it's kind of personal for you. And if you have like good experiences or memories, I think that is that the hippocampus with memory?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, going back to psychology. Just your own personal memories.
Yeah. I'm not sure with mine. Like if I would have any connotations or denotations. I'll probably come up when I read more poetry, right?
Yeah, I really think you should. Yeah.
So you mentioned a lot of how psychology and poetry has to do with familiarity, right?
Yeah.
Making it more understandable, more relatable for the audience. When it is more relatable, more understandable for the audience, I think it's kind of easier to get to the point of the poem, right? The theme, what you're trying to convey, the story, the moral, right? So are there any major techniques that writers use to get closer to their audience to be able to have that connection between poet and reader?
Yes. Well, something else, now that you bring up familiarity, is personification or the humanization of inanimate or non-human creatures or objects. If you watch any Disney movie, you'll see that, the animals all look like people, right? Because it's easier to emotionally relate to, something that looks human rather than something that, just looks like a chair.
Yes.
Not that they humanize chairs. You
never know.
You never know with Disney, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting study as well. So a lot of times we like cute puppies, right? They have huge eyes. Apparently there's supposed to be some kind of scientific study where when we see the puppies, it's like a neutral, like almost as correlation to babies, right? The bigger the eyes, with babies as well. So it's kind of interesting. So that's kind of like personification in a way as well, right? You're relating all of these nature-like or inanimate objects or something that is not human, giving it human characteristics, and that kind of gives a more of a connection, more of a nurturing kind of sense of familiarity with the audience as well.
Exactly, yeah.
Are there any other techniques that you might be using?
Yeah, I mean, you basically said it, breaking the fourth wall. I think that's one of the most important techniques you can use, which is, basically using you to address the reader directly, and it kind of brings them into the poem, and they're aware of their relation to the poem and their presence in the poem.
Yeah, so for people who might not know what breaking the fourth wall is, can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so it's basically when the writer directly addresses the reader, and kind of, calls them out, points them out to themselves. So they're aware, they have like a self-awareness as they're reading the poem. And I think it also helps them kind of emotionally connect to the poem and relate it to themselves.
How might breaking the fourth wall tie into psychology?
So yeah, I guess when you're directly addressed, it's easier to kind of bring yourself into it. The writer kind of acknowledges you for the first time, and I think that's exciting, and people kind of latch onto that and go deeper into it. it's kind of like a doorway, and you're like, come on into the poem, and you're like, okay, sure, you invited me in.
Definitely. Yeah. So we talked a lot about familiarity with the audience. Why is even considering the audience important? Why is that such a important part of when you're writing poetry, when you're reading poetry?
Yeah, you'll hear that in a lot of writing classes, consider your audience. And I think there's a lot of truth to that because, whatever community you're trying to appeal to, whatever readers, you need to kind of tailor your psychology of your poem to that audience. So, if you're writing to 5-year-olds, you don't want to use big vocabulary or something that they can't relate to.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So for our last question, considering our audience, the JSAC STEMcast, what careers might people pursue when you're trying to connect poetry and writing with STEM?
Yeah, so I think there's the great thing about poetry is that writing helps you in basically everything that you do. So whether you're in the lab writing lab reports, which, writing is really important because you need imagery for that. You need accuracy and description. Whether you're going into medical journalism or public health, epidemiology, anything you do related to STEM, you're going to have to show the world what you do. You have to convey that. And I think using imagery, using accurate language, expressing yourself is really important in anything you do. So I think it's applicable to everything in STEM, basically.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so we went over language itself, poetry, how it's impacted our lives, maybe more so for others than me, but impacting into poetry and then writing our own poetry.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so thank you for tuning in with us. See you in the next episode, and goodbye.